Welcome to the Retire Right podcast with Larry Heller. You deserve complete financial advice. There's no acceptable alternative if you want a plan to live well and on your terms. Complete financial advice equals complete peace of mind. Now, let's get into this week's podcast episode.
Hello and welcome to Retire Right with Larry Heller from Heller Wealth Management. Today, Larry has another special guest, and that is Marc Alter. Marc is here to talk about photography for a while with Larry, and I'm going to let him get into that, but I've got a little bio that I'm going to read you. This guy has done a ton. So, Marc Alter was born and raised on Long Island. He first lived in East Meadow when it was mostly farmland, then moved into a new community being built in the Harbor Green section of Massapequa. Most of his childhood was spent there. Marc went to school at NYIT studying architecture, and then Syracuse University, where he earned a BS in business management. Back in high school, he started working part-time at Durodyne Corporation, which was his family's manufacturing business in the HVAC field. After his dad sold his ownership, Marc started working for various other LI manufacturing companies in sales engineering, production control, and finally in information systems. Having started learning IS at Syracuse on 80-column key punch cards, it turned out he had a knack for systems implementation, where he made his working career and eventually earned an MS in information systems at Pace University in New York City. Marc worked for several different companies and was very successful at what he did. Marc met a wonderful woman named Jane who became the love of his life. They have now been married for 30-plus years and have a daughter named Rosie. Marc's last full-time position was as VP of Technology for Seal Dynamics, a large multinational manufacturing and distribution business in the aerospace industry. After 16 years at Seal, he decided to officially retire and pursue other interests. Marc currently spends most of his time doing IT consulting, mostly helping companies implement complex ERP systems and develop new policies and procedures. But his real passion, as you're about to find out, is photography. Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you?
I'm doing great, Eric.
All right, Larry, you brought Marc on, and before the show, you told me a little bit about him, and from what I understand, he's one of your clients.
Yeah, so Marc's a client. We're going to talk about photography. We're going to talk a little bit about Marc's vision and how we were kind of able to get him focused on, his passion of photography a little bit earlier than waiting for normal, typical retirement time. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And, everybody listening to the podcast always talk about, visualizing your life. And we talked about that when we first met Marc and Jane, and how we were able to get him and help him get him into that position because he worked hard his whole life. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, let's talk a little bit about, your passion, Marc. So how did you get involved in photography?
Well, Larry, I first learned photography from my dad, who had given me his one of his old August C3 cameras, which was a 35 millimeter film camera. And we used to go out shooting, and we shared equipment. We built a darkroom. We rolled our own film, and I got into it more and more, and I found I really had a knack for it. And I'm going to stop you right there, because one of the coolest things for me that I remember growing up is that I did have a relative, and he was into photography, had a dark room, mm-hmm. and going in the dark room with him and actually dipping the paper in the liquid and watching it come up, I thought was the coolest thing. And, today's age, if I try to mention that to one of my kids, they'd be like, look at me like with 10 eyes. Right. It's very different nowadays in the digital field, but back then it was like magic.
But does that help you become a better photographer because you went through that?
It does, because I really have a much better understanding of the underlying foundation of photography. So
then, yeah. How do you then transition from that kind of photography into the new age digital photography of today?
Well, a lot of my career was actually spent in information systems and in IT, which is information technology. And having spent over 30 or 35 years growing up in IT, going into the digital field with photography is almost natural for me.
Explain a little bit, about the types of images that you kind of create, and what do you mean by kind of digital photography?
Okay, so I mainly like to do landscapes, seascapes, cityscapes, wildlife, and impressionistic type work. And a lot of it starts with capture, where you go out with your camera and you take a look at the conditions around you and you adjust your settings and you actually take the picture. And for me, that's maybe 50 or 60% of the job or of the work. Then the rest of it is really done in the post processing, which involves taking your image from the camera, putting it on a computer, and then using various software to fine tune or manipulate the image until you get what you really want out of it.
So you can manipulate, obviously, the lighting and the color by using all the software.
Yes, and in fact, there's a lot more technology in digital photography than someone who's not involved would even know about. It starts with pixels and something called bit depth, and then it goes into color profiles and white balance, and that's all before you even get into the editing of the images themselves.
So you said that's probably 40%. So wow, that's interesting. I would have thought that actually making sure you have a good shot of whatever you're trying to do would be 80 or 90%, but it's not that high.
It depends upon the type of photography you're looking at doing. If you're doing journalistic type photography, or maybe events or street photography, then more of your image is going to be right out of the camera with maybe some minor adjustments for exposure or cropping. But the kind of work that I do, which is more on the artistic side, I need to have a good image to start with, but the image that I start with doesn't necessarily look anything like the image that I end up with.
So, give me kind of your favorite image that maybe you've done, or your, top two. I've seen some of Marc's images, and I always go, wow. And we'll talk about where you can go at the end, where you can go and look up the images and purchase some of the images. But do you have a favorite image or shot that you've done?
Well, I actually have have one image that I consider this my profile image, and it's a shot that I took of the Fire Island Lighthouse from across the bay. I was over at an area called Captree, and it gave me a nice, beautiful shot where the lighthouse is low in the picture, and then there's a lot of sky. And what I did is I then manipulated that in using Photoshop. And I created it as being a nighttime image with the bright light of the lighthouse, creating colored rings coming out at you.
That's pretty cool. So I don't know if I've seen that particular shot. You'll have to show me that. You'll have to show me that shot one time. So let's kind of take a step back, and obviously just listening to you and hearing your passion. I know the audience can't see some of the, work. So, kind of tell me about your decision to kind of stop working full time and, to spend more time on photography. Why did you do that? What were you thinking about?
Okay. Well, I was really happy working in IT, which is why I made it a career, and I had a real knack for it. But I worked at my last company, CO Dynamics, for over 16 years. The last 2.5, 3 years, I probably worked on the biggest implementation that I ever had. It was worldwide, new, complete revision of all their systems in every single location that they had. And it was all done at one single point in time. And by the time that was done, and then say 4 or 6 months after that, I was really done. I was done working. I was done doing the IT thing for work. And as you know, having conversations with you, I had the money that I could decide just to walk away and do something else. And that's what I decided to do.
Right. So we had these conversations. Marc didn't wait for the typical normal so-called retirement age. Like you mentioned, we went through the planning process, and he realized that, hey, I've got enough money here. Why not follow my passion now and figure out how to get this done. So we had a meeting with his lovely wife, Jane. And what did Jane think about this?
So she was kind of shocked I even brought it up. She said, "Are you serious? You're really going to retire? How are we going to survive?" And I said, "Well, Larry tells me we have, enough money according to our lifestyle. And as long as we keep on track with that, we can go off and do what we want to do." In fact, not only could I retire, but I've encouraged my wife to retire as well.
And how has that worked out for both of you?
It's worked out awesome. It couldn't have been better for me in terms of timing, because I'm still young enough that I can not only follow my passion with photography, but Jane and I, we go out hiking, we go out bicycle riding, we go to the beach. So there's a lot of other things that we do. It's just changed our entire lifestyle around tremendously.
Yeah, and that's so rewarding to hear, to our listeners out there that, you may not think you can do it, but if you put a plan together, you can do it, and it's turned out really rewarding. So let's talk a little bit more about your photography passion. Are there any photographers that you kind of admire, and how do they impact your work?
Yeah, there's actually both painters and photographers that I really admire. And I talk about painters originally because they're the kind of artists who look at a canvas that's completely blank, and they decide to put each dab of paint on the canvas to actually create an image and to communicate a message. And some of my favorite artists are from the Hudson River School of Artists, like Thomas Cole or Alfred Pritchard, but also artists such as Diego Rivera, his Works of Men, or Norman Rockwell. These are painters that I find, and illustrators that have learned to create a mood and a message through their imagery, which I find is amazing. When we talk about photographers, there are many, many famous photographers that I could mention, but the ones who have inspired me the most are those who I've taken workshops with. Those like Andreas Wrench or Douglas Beasley or John Paul Caponegro. So not only have I learned from them, but I've also admired the work and where they've been able to take their own passion for photography.
That's pretty interesting to hear that about the artists, and I would think that they would be kind of totally different. But it's interesting to hear how they're connected. So why don't you tell the audience, how do you create your images?
Well, sometimes when I go out shooting, I have a preconceived notion of what I'm trying to achieve. So, for instance, I had worked on a series called I Am Ant, and it was all about the life of an ant and what it was like if I was an ant. And I wake up in the morning, and how I start my day and what kind of things I encounter. And when I got done with this series, it was actually up in the Heckscher Museum in Huntington for over a month. And so that was pretty cool. But most of the time, I'm not going out with a preconceived notion. I'm maybe going to a certain place and hoping that the weather is going to be dark and rainy or cloudy and give me some real mood in the image. And then I'll just go out shooting, and I'll capture images. And then many times I won't work on that until days, weeks, or maybe even years later, when I'm reviewing my images and I feel a sense of what I want to do with the image. And then I'll pick one of the images up and start working different layers and different types of moods to get it how I see it in my mind.
So you actually have the image, and then you kind of visualize it in your mind, and then you kind of do all the software to make the images happen.
Yes, that's a big part of it.
Right.
Sometimes as I'm creating something, some inspiration will come, and I'll say, well, what if I change the shadows here, or what if I put a bird in there, or maybe change some of the coloring and the hue. And so sometimes I'm playing around with the image, but I always have a pre-concept when I'm working on an image of what I'm trying to take out of it. It's almost like a sculptor who's working on a piece of rock. He has an idea of what he's looking at the image of coming out of this rock, but doesn't necessarily know what the final image is going to look like until he's done.
That's pretty cool. I'm actually going to kind of relate it to the planning work we do, we kind of know what you want to accomplish in life and all the things you want to do. And we know what all the numbers are right now. So we got to figure out a way of getting you from where you are, and then all the strategies to get you to peace of mind and enjoying life. So I'll think of it that way. I'll think of it that way.
Right. Well, the good part of that is that's where your creativity comes in, because if I had to do that myself, it would be way over my head.
So, kind of going forward now, tell us what you want to accomplish, with your photography.
Well, I don't need it for the money. So I'm doing it more for the self-satisfaction. I like people to look at my work and to admire some of the things I've created. Many times I'm actually teaching and helping other people in their own photography path. So I've been mentoring some people. I teach some workshops and I give some lectures, and that actually has been pretty fulfilling.
Interesting. And so kind of, what's the areas that you're strong on, and kind of what do you think is kind of your weaknesses?
Well, my strengths, I would say, because I'm an ex-IT guy, I'm a technocrat, and that does not hurt in the age of digital photography. So I have an in-depth understanding of the technical side of digital photography, such as, as I mentioned before, the color profiles and the file types, and how to manipulate images in the software and yet still come out with the quality I'm looking for. But because I had studied photography when I was much younger as a boy in the film days, I also have a really good grasp of the underlying fundamentals of photography. For instance, the exposure triangle, which is made up of ISO and f-stops and shutter speeds, and exposure compensation, which is being able to take this scene in front of you and then manipulate the exposure. I have an understanding of the rules of composition, and certainly also being a technocrat and also an ex-film guy, I have a real good understanding of the camera and the lenses, filters, the use of tripods when they're appropriate, when they're not. And so I think I have a lot of background that's helped to bring me to where I am today.
And where do you want to take your photography?
I think doing more of what I'm doing now. I love teaching. I love sharing my knowledge and helping others grow. There's also still so much for me to learn that I feel that I'm just really scratching the surface, and then I could keep following this passion and not really sure where it's going to lead me.
I guess digitalize is always new software and new things that are coming out. So,
well, that's just it about technology. When I was working in IT, there was always new software versions and new levels of software and new technology being developed. And it's really the same in digital photography now. Just take a look at the last 10 or 15 years. We started out with very large cameras that produced very small files. Now the cameras themselves are getting much smaller, but the file sizes are much bigger because they contain more and more image information for us to then take and manipulate and stretch.
Pretty neat. So, Mark, tell us about some of the acknowledgments or successes that you've had.
Okay, well, I've won various awards for some of my work. Some of these through camera clubs, but also a lot of it through some national contests that I've entered. I've also had some of my work published in newspapers and in some brochures. But I've been finding more satisfaction in some of the local galleries that are now starting to hang my work. So
well, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's been a very different type of path for me. I didn't really know where it was going to take me. In fact, in January of 2020, I have a photo show going up in the Noel Ritz Theater in Oakdale.
Okay, you have to let us know about that. We'll get that information out to the audiences. So finally, what would you tell others that are thinking about retiring to follow their passion?
Oh, I would say as long as Larry Heller says you have the money to do it, you should definitely go and do it. It's certainly been the best move of my life. I don't wake up every day and rush to to shower and get dressed and rush off to work. Instead, I'm thinking, okay, so what do I want to do today? Do I want to go out shooting? And where do I want to go, and who do I want to do it with? So it's much more oriented towards fun and following my passion than in learning to make a living.
Yeah. And, I'm sure the audience can hear, because I can hear in your voice how excited you are to talk about, photography and your passion. And isn't that a great way to enjoy, the second act of your life, is where kind of I always talk about. And the second act, I believe, is a very long act. So Marc, thank you so much for coming and sharing. I want to let our listening audience know that if you want to go and see Marc's work, please go on www.mfaimages.com. That's Marc F. Alter, mfaimages.com.
Thank you very much, Larry. It's been a real pleasure.
Larry and Marc, what a fantastic podcast. Thank you so much, Larry, for bringing Marc on. Marc, I got a quick question for you. I think you said the exhibit that you did was I Am Ant, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So I've got a grandson, and I've got a granddaughter as well. He loves bugs. And I was thinking, I'm just trying to picture these in my mind. I'm going to go look it up online, but has anybody talked to you about maybe making that exhibit into like a children's book that would be interactive? Because I'm assuming the pictures are kind of from the ant level. Maybe I'm wrong, but...
No, you're absolutely right. They a lot of it is done with micro photography, and that's something that I've wondered about. Is should I take my work and go into making books with these illustrations?
Yeah, wasn't there a movie that was from like the ant level? A Disney movie?
Yes,
I think it was called Ants.
Called what?
Ants.
Ants.
Yeah,
that's right. It was called Ants.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. And there was another one called A Bug's Life. We're not plugging either one of those movies. However, I know them both because, again, I have grandchildren and children. So those were very popular. But I was just thinking, man, that would be a fantastic book, and I'd love to see that. So, Marc, if that ever happens and you decide to go down that road, I hope you update Larry so he can update the audience and they can go check it out and pick those up.
Well, if there's a publisher out there, they can certainly contact me through my webpage, and we can take it from there.
Or they can contact you through Larry, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Larry, again, thank you so much for bringing Marc on. It was a pleasure.
All right, my pleasure, Eric. This was fun.
Absolutely. All right, and thank you all for listening to the Retire Right podcast with Larry Heller. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Larry comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends, family, or a publisher, if you know one. Anyway, again, thank you for listening today. For everyone at Heller Wealth Management, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day, and we'll see you next time.